So we all know that Northumberland has some great spots to get a glimpse of the past, and we happen to be in one of them. And no, we aren't at a famous castle or even stand on Hadrian's Wall. This small patch of wetland has shown us some amazing evidence from the past. So here we are, just a few miles from Bamborough. Let's have a look at the Bradford Kaims.
The special thing about the Kaims is it's a unique landscape. The whole lake area or the wetland area funnels into a tiny little outlet at the head of the valley here, so we're getting a concentration not only of archaeology, but we're getting a concentration within the landscape itself.
The landscape is very old and very unchanged. It's a glacial landscape largely.
If you imagine before we have farming and cropping, your water holes, that's going to attract animals. You're going to have a lot of various vegetation, you can get fish. So it's a rich landscape. So we've always known that it would attract humans from their earliest times back in Northumberland. When the ice retreats, people follow.
It's never really been messed about with by modern humans. So we're getting almost a footprint from the past down here. We're getting what it would have been like in the prehistoric.
The reason that I think archaeologically it's so significant is because we get such a variation of landscape in a small space, so it makes a good study of landscape and how different types of land is used over time.
The peat preserves everything to a huge extent.
And when we get the peat deposits, the wetland sites, they're particularly rare and important because of this preservation.
We have some of the most remarkable preservation that has been seen, especially for the wooden artifacts that we have.
One of the most phenomenal things about this site is the preservation, and the preservation is especially amazing because we're in this calcareous wetland.
Some of the things that we're excavating are truly one of a kind in that there's no other parallel for it, and so this is really essential information that if it's not done right here, we don't know anywhere else that it exists currently.
Originally it was identified as a potential site of archaeological interest really by Christian Petterson, who just, because it was a peatland, thought it might be interesting. So he brought a couple of students down here and did some exploratory test pits.
And then we took over in 2010, 2011 and carried on that test pitting strategy to the point where we've got over 80 test pits from the area.
The BRP sent archaeologists down here about 4 or 5 years ago now, and we started a test pitting project through the landscape, just rolling through the landscape.
We used those test pits in 2010, 2011 to expand the ones where we'd found them into larger open area excavations, like this one behind me, which has been running for about 4 years now. So we started with test pits, investigating the landscape and the archaeology, and when we hit the archaeology, we expand out.
There's so much going on here. I think so far we've identified something like 22, maybe even 24 burnt mounds in a very small area. So that just the scale of the activity is pretty unique.
So these burnt mounds are an important feature of the site. They certainly are easy to spot in the excavation. So what went on here? What exactly are they?
A burnt mound is a heap of burnt material. It's basically a spoil heap of the material that they were burning: wood, charcoal, and perhaps sea coal in this particular burnt mound, and of course stones.
Because it's pre-pottery, you can't have a vessel to cook things in, so you have to heat up stones, move the stones to where you want them, and use the heat from the stones as almost like a extremely hot water bottle to dissipate heat into whatever it is you want to cook. So, or steam or heat or whatever.
They're heating water by heating up stones in the fire, dropping them into the water, and you can get it to a very high temperature, and you can get it to a consistent temperature using these hot stones.
A burnt mound is always tied to a source of water because they're using these stones to drop into troughs to heat water for anything that you would use it for today, really.
We know it's used for creating hot water, something we take for granted today, but I mean, you can use it for so many different things. So that's the problem with these burnt mounds. There are so many possibilities that you can do with this hot water. It's very difficult to die down exactly what they're doing to a specific burnt mound. And indeed, they may be doing many different things here.
So right now we have over 24 burnt mounds identified just in this area that you can see around here. And possibly hundreds, if not thousands, covering the post-glacial landscape itself.
To have them so tightly packed over such a long period and so big is very rare.
We've been excavating around the mound to find a context for it, to see how it fits within its landscape. And we've identified the fact that it has a relationship with the peat deposits that lie just downslope. In fact, we've got what appears to be timber platform, which now seems to be multiplying, so it's now timber platforms. And we've got burnt mound material lying over and under it.
So it looks like the Kaims could have been some sort of prehistoric factory floor. When we were on site, the team had just excavated a circular feature on one of the mounds. Could this have been one of the troughs they used for heating water? And what about those timber platforms? What were they for? Tom gave us a detailed look at the amazingly preserved features in Trench 6.
The preservation on this site is phenomenal because of the anaerobic conditions of the peat and the alkaline conditions of the peat. This gives us preservation of a large amount of wood, like this feature in front of me, which is a wooden platform feature, which is contemporaneous with the burnt mound at around about early Neolithic date. Within this, I mean, it's a generic platform of large structural elements covered in brushwood, and it's staked down with stake features such as that one in here. Within this, though, there are a number of wooden artefacts or anthropogenically modified pieces of wood. We'll start with this big one over here, which you can see is a large timber which runs from this area all the way up under the brushwood up to the top there where we lose it. It's radially split, which means that it's a trunk that's had basically a wedge taken out of it, and you can feel that because the wedge is narrow in there and wide at this end. So this is basically a segment of a timber of a tree. You can tell it's radially split because under there that's the little notch that you would have of this timber split like that, and at this end up here it's nice and flat in there, and smooth, and there's actually a bit of bark on it, so it's part of a large timber which has just been split in there, and it runs from here all the way up for about maybe a metre up the trench under all this brushwood. So that's in here. It's a fairly large structural element. We have other things. We have this piece in front of me here, which is long and thin and quite straight. We think this is probably coppiced wood, coppicing being a woodland management technique which they're employing from the start of the early Neolithic period, really, in this area. And it gives you these lovely long straight pieces of wood which are a lot more easy to use and to work rather than the sort of gnarled curved bits that you get usually on trees. And then finally we've got this piece in front of me, which again is a large piece of birch, maybe coppiced. It's relatively straight, it's quite a lot thicker than you would expect for coppiced stuff, but interestingly it's got an axe cut into it just there, where an axe or something, or some sort of cut is bit into it there, and then it's been deposited and the cut hasn't been finished. So whether they've abandoned the piece of wood or chose something different or just given up for some reason, they've deposited this within the platform feature, or this area of the platform feature. This platform feature, we were exposing it in sections, but in total it seems to be somewhere in the region of 15 metres long by 10 metres wide and about 1.2 metres deep, as it stretches out into the bottleneck of the water system to the west of us here. Okay, I'm down here in context 6084, which is another one of our platform areas. This one's especially interesting because of a series of artefacts within it, or an artefact within it. Again, it's the same general platform makeup with relatively large structural elements like this in front of me, and these ones here, and then it's covered with a general detritus layer of brushwood, as you can see all this stuff is. And then within that there's actually a relatively interesting artefact, which is this piece which you can see in front of me here. It's a long piece of birch which has been carved into a handle, which you can see here at this end. All that's carved into a handle, and the birch remains untouched up to here, and at this top end you can see it's got 3 holes carved into it, one here, and a third here where it's broken off it. We don't really know what the function of this is, what the artefact is. We've got a number of hypotheses for it currently. It could be a shuttle for weaving, it could be a sled runner, it could be a lasso handle for herding reindeer. We really don't know. The issue with dealing with prehistory that is this old and this well preserved is that there's really no parallels for the artefacts that you get out of it. All we can do is really draw ethnographic and anthropological analogies which come with issues in themselves. But regardless of that, we've got a very exciting, ambiguous and enigmatic artefact in front of us, and next year we intend to lift it and analyse it properly in the lab.
So the Kaims is giving us as many questions as it is answers. And it looks like this landscape has been used for thousands of years. but the very ground itself has a story to tell.
So I'm not an archaeologist. I effectively try and reconstruct what this place looked like, the whole area, when they were doing all this and making the burnt mounds and making this timber platform. So they focus on the site and I focus on the landscape. At the moment what we're doing is coring. So we have a metre long metal tube and I'm just pushing it in the ground, and every time I push it in the ground I can sample a metre of whatever I pull out. Then I look at that and I write down notes of what the stuff is and what it might indicate. Then you go back and you push the more rods down. So I can get down here 2.5 to 3 metres, and then we hit rock at the bottom. So with the stuff I do, I can look underneath the platform. That's the key thing. It'll take them decades to get down to the bottom of this timber platform, because the bottom of it is about 2 metres down. But I can push through that and I can look at what's underneath. And I can work out what happened before they built the platform, what happened when they were doing it, how much soil erosion they created, all these sorts of things.
Richard is just brilliant at it. If you get him to talk about a core, he will tell you that, you know, this is marl, this is laid down after the ice has retreated, but the temperature has risen, so this is quite hot period, and he'll tell you, oh, these are wet periods. And then when you look at the pollen and the other material, he can tell you the kind of trees that were growing around the landscape when the first sort of seeds associated with farming start blowing into the peat bog.
Pollen from grasses like this, they'll come out. If you wave it around, there'll be pollen. There are thousands of pollen grains that I'm just waving around here. You can't see them because they're all microscopic. And they'll float around and they'll land on a peat surface at some time in the past. But we can work out then how much of this was grass, how much of it was under fields. They were growing crops. Were there trees around here? Were they cutting the trees down? Because of course they're using lots of timber somehow to set fire to heat up the stones before they throw them in the trough. So it's probable, because this is a huge burnt mound, that they're really cutting down trees, and we ought to be able to see them cutting the trees down, and the pollen from the trees gets lessened.
What Richard is doing for us, in a nutshell, is reconstructing the last 10,000 years of the environment at Bradford Kaims.
That's what I do.
So here we are at the Bradford Kaims. We've been doing loads of archaeology, we've been digging up amazing artefacts that we're not entirely sure what they are. And that's one problem with archaeology. It's all well and good digging things up, looking at them, trying to figure out what they are. What we need is to know how these people lived. We need to know what they were doing with the burnt mounds that we've found. We need to know what they were doing with the artefacts that we've found. And that's what experimental archaeology is. It means going back and doing the things that they do, whether that means basket weaving or brewing your own beer.
This year we started brewing beer, not in a highly scientific way, mostly in a way just to find out if it was possible to do it here at the site.
It's a hypothesis that comes from most of the Irish burnt mounds. Some of their troughs have been found associated with grain inside the trough.
We tried to do it as accurately as possible as what it would have been done during the Neolithic time period.
And it doesn't have hops because hops wouldn't have been available in this region 7,000 years ago.
So we've gotten some barley from Simpson's Malt, which is a local company. Just heat it in water.
Basically we're using a trough, we're using a stone trough. All of the one that we have on site here is wooden, to heat up water.
Mix it up, crush it up a bit to release the sugars, add hot stones to the water, get it to the right temperature, and you cook that for an hour, 2 hours.
We poured honey into it as well, which causes greater activation in reaction from the yeast, because then the yeast is going to eat the sugar from the honey as well.
And then we just added some honey, some elderflowers, and we left it to ferment for a matter of days, and it quickly gets up to about 4%, 5%.
You allow it to ferment for about a week, and it gives you a beer of roughly 4% that we ended up drinking.
It's not like any beer you would have tasted before, but it's what we believe, or close to, what they would have had roughly 7,000 years ago.
We were just trying to figure out if we could do it first and if it was fun.
Could have made it a lot better if, well, I think next time we make it, we will make it a lot better.
I do historical reconstruction with textiles and basketry, and I've been asked to come down to the Kaims to show them some basketry using some of the materials that they have here. And one of the best materials that we're standing right in front of is this rush, which flowers don't really do very much. Apparently you can eat it, but it isn't very tasty. But it's a fantastic construction material, and you can do all sorts of things with it. And one of the simplest things is to make a rope. And you just make a rope by twisting it around each other. It's got a core to it inside, a little spongy core, and that enables it to be squashed so that you can do any number of different things with it. It's a really good thatching material. It's really good for cordage and rope. It's the sort of thing that you could very easily make a fishing net out of. You could also use it for perhaps a roofing material. It's very waterproof, it's compact, and again when it dries out it's lightweight, so it's ideal to go on the roof. The other thing that we have just across the field is some sedge, which is a thick grass-like material, which is also really, really good for weaving. The area of the field where this bog area narrows could have been an ideal spot to trap fish, either with baskets or with nets. It wouldn't take a group of people very long to make it quite a large size net. And if you've got little coracle type skin covered boats or dugout canoes in the early periods, you would be able to get maybe half a dozen people out on the fen driving the fish one way in little boats and get to that bottleneck, have a net strung out across it and catch everything. You've got a huge catch all in one go, and that might be one possible reason why there's a concentration of events going on down in that area, because if you're catching hundreds of fish or eels and processing them, you've got the burnt mounds for the heat source for cooking them.
We've had a fascinating visit to the Kaims, and these little holes in the ground have become amazing windows into the past. There's still so much to find out about what went on here thousands of years ago. Who were the people who built the platforms and lit their fires here? Before we left, we had a look at some of their tools and possessions, and the Kaims had a final surprise for us.
And these are just flint arrowheads that actually came out of Trench 42. These are both Bronze Age, and they came out of what could have potentially been a working area, because we're getting not only specifically worked tools that have already been made, but we're getting also lots of worked flint cores as well as debitage, so you know that they've been flaking off pieces. I also have them currently wrapped in acid-free tissue paper so that they can be tested later on, so you can see specifically what they could have been hunting at the time period. Along with arrowheads, other little microliths that we're also getting out are flint blades. So if you notice, the blade is elongated in structure and it's been touched on either side. So it's been used for cutting. And it's also been wrapped up in acid-free tissue, because then you can specifically test it for lipid analysis so that you can show what they've been working with and cutting with in correlation to the animals that have been caught. We not only have what they were hunting with and then what they were cutting with afterwards, but this is a flint thumb scraper. So this is what they would have been taking off any excess meat from the hide with as well. So you've got your arrowheads, your blades, and your scrapers. And the last thing I was going to discuss is this is sea coal. Originally we thought that it could have been jet, but if you take a piece of sandpaper, if you take a tile, if you rub jet across the tile, it's going to come across as brown, because it's actually composed of wood from the monkey puzzle tree. Whereas this, we've had experts come in which they've said, we've had one say shale and the other say that it's sea coal or cannel coal. If it is cannel coal coming out of Trench 6, what they could have been potentially doing is heating up the cannel coal so that oil comes to the surface, and then you can you can scrape off the oil and use that as a fuel. It's also known as fracking. If they were doing this, the earliest known date is Roman period, in which they were actually using sea coal as a fuel, whereas Trench 6 has been dated to about 6,500 years ago. So it could potentially predate the earliest known date by 4,000 years.